Good evening to everybody, and good morning to those in North America. Good afternoon to those in Europe. Welcome to this time and to this space as we welcome our friends from YouTube who are beginning to join us. And in just a few seconds, I'm going to start the live webinar, which I'm about to do now, as we start welcoming people into the webinar space, into the Zoom space. So, it's such a delightful occasion for all of us today because, as I was telling Dr. Doty just a few minutes back, I was visiting the home of my dear friends Letha and Carl Spetzler in the Palo Alto area. And one afternoon after we had lunch, Letha, who's a delightful friend, she presented me the book, which is now, I understand, in 43 languages, different parts of the world. And I first got to understand who is this amazing neurosurgeon and doctor who sources inspiration and compassion and mindfulness. So that was a very unusual combination. So I was very attracted to learning more about him. And soon after that, I was invited to be part of the World Compassion Council, and I was overjoyed to see Dr. Doty in that forum as well. And no surprise, of course. And then I had the joy, I and Dr. Susie Roy, our yoga and mindfulness teacher, along with Cam Danielson and his partner Pam, we came to visit. And we went to Dr. Doty's chambers. We met his wonderful dog first and all the patients who were waiting, and they all had a big smile on their face, so very unusual experience to go to a neurosurgeon's office, and you would expect some people sitting there kind of anxious, but everybody seemed to have such bright smiles on their faces. So, that experience of that hour we spent there was very, very wonderful. So thank you, James. Thank you, Dr. Doty, for giving us this gift of your time, and welcome to the Soil Digital Forum.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm appreciative. And of course, the work you're doing is, in many ways, bringing compassion to the world through the business environment. And I believe, of course, it's very much needed as well.
Thank you very much. So, my favorite question that I always begin by asking, James, you've had a very wonderful life, and I think it's a real blessing to have been given the kind of experience you have been given in our world. So how did it all start? Tell us about your early part of your life and your growing up and your early influences. Help us to understand your journey.
Well, it's interesting because many people believe that if they always have everything, if everything comes to them, if they want something, they're able to have it, and that means success, and that will make them happy. And one of the things I learned is that actually suffering and overcoming suffering and building resistance and then finding purpose through helping others actually ultimately is what is most important. And in regard to my background, I had a challenging background, and my father was an alcoholic, and my mother had had a stroke when I was a child, was partially paralyzed, had a seizure disorder, and was chronically depressed, and in fact attempted suicide multiple times. As a child, we were on public assistance essentially my entire childhood. And of course, going through that is in some ways a chronic trauma. It's very chaotic. It can't be predicted what's going to happen to you. And as a result, especially for a child, you become anxious, afraid, you have despair, you feel you don't have a future because you don't have mentors, you don't have money, you don't have access. And frankly, I was becoming a juvenile delinquent. But what changed everything was at the age of 12, I actually rode my bicycle to a strip mall, this area where they had a bunch of businesses together. And one of those was a magic shop, and I had an interest in magic. And I walked in, and I was greeted by a wonderful woman who actually was reading a paperback novel, and she had her glasses down to her nose like this and a chain on and gray hair. And she looked up at me and she greeted me with this radiant smile. And we began a conversation. And as it turned out, she knew nothing about magic from the magic store. Her son owned the store, and she just happened to be there because she was visiting for the summer. But what happened was that she made me feel very safe. And one of the key components of being open is you have to feel psychologically safe. And with her radiant smile and the fact that she greeted me, treated me actually like an equal in terms of our conversation, really made me feel good and felt that I could trust her. And as a result, after about 20 minutes of conversation, she said, I really like you, and I'm here for another 6 weeks. And if you show up every day, I think I could teach you something that could really help you. And that 6-week interaction changed the trajectory of my life.
And what did she teach you?
Well, what I did not appreciate is that, of course, stress can translate into anxiety. It can translate into fear. It can make your muscles tense. It allows you not to be able to focus because you never know what's going to happen. And so one of the first things she taught me, which is now they use the terminology, a body survey with a breathing technique. At that time, though, in the 60s, while of course we had the hippie movement, this was out in Lancaster, and this terminology, mindfulness, meditation, neuroplasticity, were not even heard of. But she taught me this breathing practice and this relaxation technique. And it was really quite amazing because while initially I didn't really believe it was doing anything, what I soon realized, it was changing everything. And it changed everything because instead of trying to anticipate events happening that I had no control over, I was able to be present and attend. And being present and attending is really necessary for one to learn. And so that was the first technique she taught me, if you want to call it relaxing the body. But the next technique was just as important, and it was taming the mind. And what I mean by that is I did not appreciate that I had a negative dialogue going on in my head. And as a result, when you tell yourself you're not good enough, when you tell yourself it's not possible, that actually will become your reality. And many of us hear these words and we think they're truth. And in fact, they're not at all. As a species, we evolved to be attuned to events that could threaten us. Thus, if you saw a grass moving on the savanna near you, you assumed it was a lion, and then you engage your sympathetic nervous system to allow you to run off and survive. But unfortunately, those same mechanisms that have you respond to events that threaten your life also create this narrative. And as a result, I had this going on in my head. And what she taught me was that that type of a negative dialogue, saying you can't or it's not possible, is actually creating a prison for yourself, where you're putting the bricks down and the walls get higher, it gets darker. And essentially by doing so, you give your personal power away. You basically say that external events are limiting you. And what she did was she taught me that this was a false narrative and gave me tools to change that negativity or that being hypercritical with myself to ones of self-affirmation and self-compassion. And as a result, it really changed my perspective of the world and of myself. And I could say that I felt worthy, that I deserved it, that everything was possible. And from there, she made me realize that how we look at the world oftentimes has to do with how we are inside of ourselves. And if you're hypercritical, if you're negative, that becomes your perception of how others are. It's this classic transference. And then as a result, that impedes your own ability to connect with others. And what I found was that when I changed how I perceived the world changed how it perceived me. And that had a huge, huge impact.
How wonderful. What you just spoke about are perhaps the most fundamental truths in life. And in fact, that is the whole foundation of the spiritual life that you just mentioned. So tell us then, after that was at 12, and then how did you end up being a neurosurgeon? Tell us about that journey.
Well, when I was in fourth grade, I was at school and we had a professions day, and a pediatrician came and visited my classroom. And again, this was one of these people who made you feel important, made you feel that your opinion mattered. And he just radiated, if you will, compassion and kindness. And at that moment, I said, I'm going to be a doctor. Now, saying you're going to be a doctor and from my circumstance, manifesting that are two very different things. But that belief stayed within me. And in this period of time with this woman in the magic shop, whose name was Ruth, she actually taught me a technique of visualization and manifestation. And basically, it's something very similar to what sports psychologists do. You visualize how something is going to be. But she brought in using all of your senses, writing it down, reading what you wrote, sitting there with the image of it happening, seeing yourself in that position. And what happens in that situation is it goes into your subconscious. And then you become attuned to opportunities or situations that will allow you to have your dreams manifested. And one of the things, of course, I put on this list was to be a doctor. And I tell people it's in some ways like I see a patient and I tell them their diagnosis, and they'll say, my goodness, I've never seen or even heard of that before. Then they come back to me a month or so later, and they go, it's the most amazing thing. I've run across 5 people who have the same thing. And the reason that is because it's been put into their subconscious, and now they're highly attuned to that or to situations that will allow them, if you will, to respond or to manifest. And certainly this was my case.
How very nice. And here you are then, you actually visualized and your dreams manifested into reality. I had a spiritual teacher from a young age. His name is Swami Chinmayananda. And he would always tell us that faith is visualizing with all your presence something that you imagine to happen, the reward for which is that it actually happens. And he would say some words to that effect. So, this is exactly what I'm so glad that happened with you.
Well, the interesting thing is that people diminish their own personal power. And in fact, many people will listen to what others tell them about themselves. I mean, I'm sure there are members of your audience who will sit there and say, well, I told my brother, my best friend, or my parents that I wanted to do X, Y, or Z, and they said, that's impossible, you won't be able to do it. And now that can be a driver for people to aspire to do things, but it's a horrible driver because you carry this baggage your whole life to try to prove something to someone versus somebody telling you, you can do anything, I believe in you, you're extraordinary. And to me, that's a much more positive driver to motivate you. So.
How wonderful. Now, in all your, after becoming then a doctor and a neurosurgeon and this whole life that you've lived till today, What are the moments that stand out for you when you were at your happiest best? When you and the people that you were associated with did something which in your life memories, they stand out as special moments in your life?
Well, it's interesting because early on you mentioned that my own background and talking about special moments. My own experience has been the places where I have learned the greatest lessons are not those personal peaks in my life. While it's wonderful to achieve something, the problem is that many people get attachment to an outcome, or instead of having attachment to the goal. And what I mean by that is if you don't achieve it, for many people that creates unhappiness. That being said, when I look at my own life and the greatest lessons that I have learned and that have benefited me in my own journey are actually when I have been suffering, when I've had to overcome very difficult times, because that's told me my who I am, my ability to have resilience, and in many ways, it's a manifestation of sort of the goodness in your heart and your belief in possibilities. And you asked that question, I have to tell you that certainly there have been many, and certainly getting married, having children have been peaks. But probably the greatest lesson is that, as you know from my background, I had extraordinary success, not only as a physician and a neurosurgeon, but as an entrepreneur. And at one point during the dot-com period, I was worth about $80 million, and I was living extraordinarily well. I had a penthouse, I had Ferraris, Porsches, etc. And I would come home miserable every day because I had the mistaken belief that the acquisition of these things would actually make me happy. But what I didn't understand was that these were manifestations of my own insecurity, my shame, and trying to prove something to someone. To, if you will, get the monkey off of my back, which was this feeling of inadequacy due to poverty. And when I ended up after the dot-com crash, I lost $80 million in about 6 weeks. And I had an outstanding loan of about $15 million. And when you owe money to a bank, they become your best friend. Essentially, I had to sell everything. And as I was contemplating the situation, I actually, and I remember this very clearly, sitting on the steps of my almost empty house, which I had to sell, reflecting on my journey and saying, what possibly went wrong here? How did this happen? And it made me reflect back on the lessons that Ruth had taught me. And one of those lessons is be careful of what you ask for versus what you need. And also the reality that my journey to that point had been about me achieving things and not so much about my achieving things to be of service to others. And it was a period of time where I went through this period of reflection. And so, interestingly enough, here I am about $3 million in debt. And as I was going through all the legal papers associated with that, I had made a donation of stock to charity, of the only financial asset actually that might have possibilities of being viable. And I was meeting with my attorneys and they said, listen, we have to tell you, we actually did not turn this paperwork in. And I was at a point where I could have not done that and be worth $30 million. But what I did do was I ended up giving $30 million away to charity while I was $3 million in the hole. Now, I have to tell you, my wife told me I was insane. But what I tell people is losing everything gave me everything. And what I mean by that is that then my life switched to perceiving the world through being of service, which is actually what Ruth had taught me. I just hadn't listened because I was 12. And that changed everything. And as a result, this is one of the reasons I started the Center for Compassion, of which His Holiness is the founding benefactor. And this is why I do the work that I do. And it has led actually to extraordinary things and has been a precious gift. So my ultimate happiness was finding purpose and meaning, but it was through pain and suffering.
How nice. Tell us more about the Center for Compassion and tell us about that journey and how it's manifesting in the world.
Sure. So I had left Stanford for a period of time and decided to come back in 2008. And during the period of my absence, this issue of the value proposition of compassion was boiling in my head, if you will. And I felt it was extraordinarily important. And of course, if you look at the basis of every religion, you find that compassion is the foundation. And although I am a non-believer, if you will, I tell people I'm an atheist, I very passionately believe, though, in the value proposition of compassion and how it can change your life. And when I came back to Stanford, I decided to study this. And as I mentioned earlier, it was met with a fair amount of resistance, where I said that people in the academic community told me that was a waste of time. Well, I ignored them, and fortunately, I had the resources to fund that myself, and we found some amazing things. And it started out initially as something just called Project Compassion, which was sort of my own personal project. And then as I was walking through Stanford one day, and again, you have to realize I actually had no interest in the Dalai Lama whatsoever. And in fact, my wife had a great interest in the Dalai Lama, and she had bought tickets to an event earlier, one for her and I refused to go because I had no interest. But I'm walking through Stanford, and suddenly the image of the Dalai Lama comes into my head. And it was fascinating because I couldn't shake it. And basically, this image wouldn't go away. And it, in some ways, forced me to think about how he could benefit the work that I'm doing. And we were about to publish some research. So I actually put it out there, if you will, that I wanted to meet him and invite him. And of course, amazingly, that manifested. And we spent initially about an hour, theoretically, it was supposed to be 15 minutes. We ended up talking for an hour and a half. And at the end of it, not only did he agree to come to Stanford, he had this animated dialogue with his primary English translator, Thupten Jinpa. And they were speaking in Tibetan. At the end of it, Jinpa turned to me and he said, Jim, His Holiness is so moved by the work you're doing, he wants to make a personal donation. And at that time, the donation he made to this work was the largest donation he had ever given to a non-Tibetan cause. And of course, this was after our very first meeting. And so I was very moved and overwhelmed by this. And then he and I became friends. He did come to Stanford, and I hosted him at multiple times beyond that. And then I became chairman of the Dalai Lama Foundation, actually. But additionally, this work ended up connecting me with a lot of spiritual and religious leaders. And the amazing thing is that in all my interactions with these different individuals, I've never been asked about the dogma of their religious beliefs. And the reason is that an evolved spiritual or religious leader is beyond the dogma of his religion. And what I mean by that is these people have the ability to intuit somebody at their core in a microsecond. And if your core is love, if your core is compassion, if your core is kindness, then you're immediately embraced. And that has been my repeated experience and why I have been so blessed to spend time with so many evolved spiritual leaders, and I mentioned a little earlier before we went on, including Amma, the hugging saint, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, Sadhguru, Radhanath Swami, Desmond Tutu, and a variety of others. So that's sort of the story of how the center came, how the Dalai Lama got involved. From early on, we were doing a variety of research projects. We developed a compassion cultivation training program that's taught around the world. And more recently, I edited a textbook called the Oxford Handbook of Compassion Science.
Very nice. So in this wonderful work that has been unfolding, if you look back in the last few years, when you have this strong inspiration being sourced from inside and you go forward, and yet sometimes challenges come from the world. So what has been the biggest obstacle or the biggest challenge that you have faced when you started going on this path, and what did you learn from that?
Well, I think that for many people, this perception of compassion seemed to be woo-woo or not based in reality. And it was sort of an idealistic perspective that wasn't really useful in the world. And I think the thing I've learned and that is that's just not true. And when I met people who were resistant to this, fortunately, I had the self-confidence and the belief to not let that affect me and proceeded forward. And I think that's a lesson all of us can learn, is that when you believe in something wholeheartedly, there are always going to be naysayers when you are breaking ground on paths that are not traditional or typically accepted in society. What we know now from my work and that of a number of other individuals is that when an individual practices compassion, it has a profound effect on their own physiology, as well as profoundly affecting the other person. And in some ways, when people observe people being kind and compassionate, it positively impacts them as well. And this is really, really important. In fact, the Dalai Lama says it is one of the only times that you should be selfish. And what he means by that is when you practice compassion, you receive so much more benefit that it's okay. And what's amazing is the science even bears out that being compassionate has more benefit in terms of your health than being at your ideal body weight or exercise. And so people don't understand, if you will, oftentimes, and I think certainly the Indian continent has been much more attuned to how your emotional state, your inner state, affects your physiology. But many people have not really embraced this in the West, although certainly over the last number of years, that's becoming more and more evident. But it's profoundly true. And the other reality is that happiness is not found from external sources. Happiness is found from internal sources. And this is when you connect with yourself, when you understand your purpose, when you get over your fear, everything changes in your world. And people will say, well, you know, this event happened to me and it's horrible and it's changed everything. Well, events don't have any power. You give them power. You give them power by attaching emotion to them. And for many people, a negative event or a negative interaction with somebody creates a lot of emotional stress. And every time they think of it, it brings it back. If you think of it strictly as an event with no power, then it can't control you. And in some ways, this is the nature of attachment. I look at the world through the perspective of a Japanese philosophy called wabi-sabi. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but this is this idea of impermanence, incompleteness, and imperfection. And when you accept that that's the nature of reality, I think it changes your perception. The other interesting Japanese aesthetic is something called kintsugi, which I also embrace. And this was developed centuries ago. And what it was this idea that a piece of pottery, if it broke, and these were very expensive, very hard to make, instead of repairing it in traditional ways, what they started repairing it was glue that was imbued with gold. And so that when you saw the repaired pottery, you could see all the breaks in it, which were shown by this gold line, if you will. And the point of it was that all of us are frail, fragile human beings, and there's no reason to hide your mistakes, your failings, or pretend you're not a human being. And I think by embracing this and sitting with these imperfections, it actually is a great source of strength, because many, many people are terrified of being perceived as weak, and they carry this shield of who they want people to perceive them as. Like, as an example, I'm a neurosurgeon, I've done this, I've done that, I'm important. And the reality is none of us are important except through the path of love. So that's how I view the world.
How wonderful. And there are so many people from the spiritual organization Chinmaya Mission who are here, from the high school in Delhi to the high school in a place called Unchahar to the degree college in Haridwar, and so many people have chosen to come. So they are greeting themselves in their traditional way. So welcome everybody. Hari Om is the term they use. Thank you for being part of this, and please do start writing your questions in the Q&A box, because this is a webinar format. You are not interacting with your voice, but you can interact by typing your questions. And the prodigal son of soil returns, Sapan Gandhi, our alum, who's now working in London. So Sapan, say something about yourself and your journey to everybody. And then you may ask a question from your own. And then you may also look at the Q&A box and the chat box and read out the question for James. So please go ahead.
Sure, sir. So first of all, many thanks for giving me this opportunity to interact with you and Dr. Doty. It has been a very very informative session for me, because there are a lot of things that you know but you do not realize. But when you interact with sages like you, it helps us to reflect and understand what all are we missing in our daily lives. What all should we think? Like, for example, you talked about how as a child you were taught about things which were like as relevant in 60s as they are relevant right now. Like, for example, uh, uh, the techniques of self-affirmation and the breathing practice that we keep on hearing every now and then about, to de-stress ourselves, and how much it is important to tame our minds. So it was very informative. Thank you so much for that. And just a brief about me, I'm from the 2012-13 batch of soil, which was called the anchors batch. And I after I passed out from soil, I joined CIPLA, and I'm currently working with CIPLA only. Uh, so I worked with CIPLA in Mumbai, and then I moved to Belgium. I was there for about 2.5 years, and then I moved to London. So I'm currently working in commercial strategy and business development. So that's a brief about me. And I would actually just want to ask one question. So when we were interacting initially, Dr. Doty, you mentioned about something called Compassionate Countries Index. So we have always heard about the happiness index of all the countries. This list comes out every year. So if you have to look at a correlation between the compassionate index of the countries and the happiness index, how would you correlate the two? Do you think that the countries which are like at the top of the happiness index will be the countries which will be at the top of the compassionate index as well? So because you have done a lot of research in both the fields. Yeah.
Sure. I would say, generally speaking, yes. Some countries, though, try to manipulate the happiness index, if you will. And as you know, the happiness index is a measure of how people feel about themselves within their country. the Compassionate Countries Index is a little bit different. It utilizes some of these different measures, but what it does is it does three things. One is, of course, it does have the question of how do you feel you're thriving in the country, or what benefits the country has to you. But on a country level, it examines other measures of how a country is striving to be a benefit to the population. As an example, how many people are incarcerated relative to the population. As an example, in the United States, ours far exceeds any other country. And that's another issue for discussion at a different date. But how many people are incarcerated? How many people are below the poverty line? Do you offer free education? Do you offer childcare? Do you offer paternity benefits? And fundamentally, it's what is the social safety net for its citizenry. And then, of course, it also looks at immigration. Are you open to immigration? Do you have an open society? And then the third component is, as a country, what am I doing to benefit the planet and others? And what I mean by that, of course, is issues related to climate change, sustainability, weapons, manufacture of weapons, and things of this nature. So it's not just an individual index of happiness, it is actually looking at a variety of different measures that not only involve the individual, but also involve the government as well.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Just maybe one last question from me before I move to some Q&As from the audience. See, the topic of this session is becoming the best version of oneself. So I just wanted to ask you, because this is actually very personal usually, right? But if, say, for someone has to practice or someone has to reflect, then what would be your recommendation that how should a person approach in identifying what would be the best version of oneself, and what should be the approach in your suggestion?
Well, I don't necessarily think there is one approach. As an example, there are some people who have certain religious beliefs, and the strength within their religious belief helps them become their best selves. Now, of course, it can also make them become their worst selves as well. So I think that many people strive in some ways to attach being their best selves, oftentimes something outside of themselves, but really the answers are inside. And what I mean by that is one of the things that limits us from being our best self is the false narrative of you're not good enough. And for many people, that's manifested by imposter syndrome. And you are good enough, and you're worthy of success, and you're worthy of love, and you're worthy of accomplishment. And when you're able to internalize that feeling, it helps dissipate the fear, because in some ways, this is a choice between fear, which limits you, and then makes you see the world through a set of eyes that is quite negative and suspicious of things, from love, which gives you an openness, an inclusiveness, a perspective of possibilities. And I think that when you're able to do these types of practices, a breathing practice, when you're able to sit with calmness, when you're able to relax, and you can reflect on who this person is inside of you and look at role models who demonstrate these types of behaviors, that is the path that can take you to where you want to be. But it's not a path of attachment to the typical measures of success in society. And not that there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but it has to be tempered by your achievements being related to how good you are, how kind you are, how compassionate you are, how grateful you are, how forgiving you are. That will get you to the point of true meaning and purpose in life, which to me is really the deepest manifestation of happiness.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. That was very insightful, Doctor. So I'll come to the Q&As from the audience. So I guess one of the audience have mentioned that they have read your book and they have found it really, really very helpful. One of the audience is asking, uh, when we talk about compassion, do you think it's a skill that can be learned, or is it something which is a characteristic of human beings, and not a lot can be done about it? And
And Sapan, please name the person who's asking the question. Let's acknowledge the person as well.
They
sure,
might
this
be
is from
embarrassed.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
yeah, this is from Mr. Rama Raju Dasradha,
Yeah.
so who
Rama.
is asking this question.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. So can you just say the question one more time? It was, can compassion be taught, and are we limited by whatever to some behavior related to that or not? So I'll tell you a couple things. First of all, psychopathy or sociopathy, of course, is a manifestation of someone not having compassion. And that is genetic and can represent a structural anomaly in the brain. And in fact, children as early as 4, 5, 6 years old can be determined to be sociopathic by imaging studies. So that is a group of people who do not have the capacity to improve themselves. Additionally, studies have been shown, and one correlate is a study in voles, which are a particular type of rodent, in terms of receptors for oxytocin. And oxytocin, many people call it the love or nurturing hormone. In one subset of voles, they are monogamous. In another set of voles, they're polygamous, and they don't stay with a partner. And the one that does not stay with the partner has a decrease in receptors for oxytocin. And so they are limited in their capacity as well, but not to the extent of, let's say, a sociopath. And this manifests in humans as well. There are individuals who do not have these receptors, or have a decreased number or a different type of receptor. And they oftentimes are not monogamous or really care. That being said, for most people, compassion is similar to a muscle. To increase your muscular strength, you have to exercise. To increase compassion, you have to understand what it is and be motivated to be compassionate. And the more you do it, the stronger the muscle gets. And as an example, people look at Olympic athletes and they go, that's amazing what they can do. The reality is, an Olympic athlete has a certain genetic predisposition, and it just happens to align with their interests, and they are able to function at a far higher level than most people. Well, each of us has a genetic profile, if you will, for compassion. We just haven't exercised it enough. And so I would suggest to you that it is absolutely possible. And in fact, we have a program, a compassion cultivation training program, that clearly has demonstrated, and we have papers published on this, that you can increase your compassion for self and others. And so, yes, it is a trainable skill. It's available to almost everyone. And if you embrace it, it will change your life.
Thank you so much. Anil sir, would you want to take up some question?
Yeah, Ambujakshan Nair is asking a question. He's saying, are we diminishing our own personal power and equity when we are forced to match the uncivilized animosity of a mischief monger, pulling us into a dirty altercation?
Well, yes. One of the challenges is if you try to live a compassionate life or a life of kindness, it can put you in some challenging situations, especially with people who are I'm not sure if not evolved as much is the right word, but who have a different worldview. That in and of itself should not change your belief in the world or your belief in yourself. Many people think, as we discussed earlier, that compassion demonstrates weakness, and nothing could be further from the truth. But that being said, compassion does not mean that you let people beat you up or step on you or take advantage of you. And one of the most compassionate things you can actually do is stand up to others and speak your truth. And they may not like it, and it may require you to look for a different job or be in a different position. But that is far better than people taking advantage of you or using you for their own purposes.
Professor Arjya Chakravarti, who chairs our Human Resources Leadership Program, and she's read your book, and as she says, she admires every single word written in the book. And she says, could you please share with our students how they may visualize this whole methodology of visualization? Could you give some insights to our students on that?
Sure. Well, I think if you have a meditative practice, I mean, one of the first things, and what I do is I, if you will, get into this state where I've relaxed, I'm breathing, I'm trying to clear my thoughts, and then I think about my intention or how I want to manifest things. And once I do that, I repeat it to myself multiple times every day. But I also, again, as I said earlier, I make a list, I look at it, I repeat what it says, and then I sit with that and meditate on that for a period of time. And in my own experience, that gives you this ability to have things manifest. Now, I am not going to tell you that if you do that, everything in your life will be perfect and come out the way you want. But what I will tell you is by using that technique, if there is a possibility of it happening, that is the best way to have it manifest, by doing that technique. And you do mention my book. Anyone who's interested can purchase the book. Not that I'm necessarily trying to sell it. I think you can also get it in other ways. But Into the Magic Shop, a neurosurgeon's quest to discover the mysteries of the brain and the secrets of the heart, really has those lessons in it, as well as others. And it's in a number of languages. It's a bestseller in the United Arab Emirates, in Poland, in Russia, in South Korea, and even actually some of your listeners may know Korean pop music or K-pop. And there's a band called BTS, which is probably one of the most popular bands in the world right now. And they actually used my book as the basis for their third album called Love Yourself, Tear. And there's a song in there called Magic Shop. And so in some ways, it's quite extraordinary how this book has gone all over the world and has meant so much. And the reality is that everyone on some level suffers. And giving people through the memoir tools that allow them to look at themselves, to accept themselves, to change themselves, whether for me or other people, I think can be extraordinarily powerful. A lot of people will say, well, you know, I don't have the resources, I can't do that, or I can't do this. But these are all free. And you don't need to have money, you don't need to have resources to change your mind. Epictetus, who was a Stoic philosopher, said, I cannot change how people feel or act towards me, but what I do have control over is how I think. And I think that's very, very true.
Thank you. Jody Bresky is asking a question. She's saying that thank you for sharing your story so openly. And what are the plans for your organization going forward? What's the mission and what projects are you working on?
Well, I have a grand vision, which is only limited by money. And so it depends on how our benefactors or grant organizations offer us resources. But that being said, we're developing some new compassion training programs, which we'll be launching early next year. We have the Applied Compassion Academy presently ongoing. I'm actually, as I mentioned earlier, working on a project that intersects with C-Care, which is utilizing a virtual human and artificial intelligence and natural language programming on a mobile app that interprets an individual's emotional state from camera or voice intonation or heart rate variability, and then determines how stressed and anxious they are, and then guides them through different practices to decrease their stress and anxiety. Also, we're continuing to look at different measures of how compassion affects one's physiology. And then, as I mentioned, we're working on this Compassion Countries Index and this Compassionate Companies Index.
Very nice. Would you like to read, Sapan, some questions from the Q&A box? Mr. Ajay Mutreja's question, for example. How can you correlate that question right on top?
Yeah, so Ajay Mutreja asks, how can you correlate admiration with compassion?
Well, I think they're two very different things. I mean, frankly, a bad person can be admired by people, whether it's in the United States with Mr. Trump or Hitler. These types of people had their admirers. Well, that really has nothing to do with compassion or empathy. So I don't think they're necessarily related whatsoever. Admiration in some way is looking at another who you would like to be like. And again, for good and for bad. Some people admire rich people. Some people look at Bill Gates or other billionaires and say, I want to be like that. But that admiration, now Bill Gates is a somewhat different story, but admiration for rich people, simply because you want to be rich, doesn't translate into happiness. It doesn't translate into being of service to other people. So I think they're very, very different.
Michelle Abraham, who's a dear friend based in Toronto, he's a physician. And, he had this very unique experience in his life when he had some health problems, a heart problem at a young age. And he decided to now pursue a life of really pursuing compassion and education in compassion as well. So Michelle is like a fellow traveler. And Michelle is asking a question. He said, as a physician, he believes that in the power of music and art to educate, heal, and inspire. How much weight do you put on the arts? And do you see the arts going to play an increasing role in healthcare and community health?
Well, it's interesting. During World War II, someone questioned the value of putting resources into arts and music and culture. And basically what Churchill said was, essentially, that's what makes us human. And I think people very much resonate with art, culture, music, the humanities, because that really, in some ways, inspires us, and inspires us oftentimes to be our best selves. We know that music, even reading, actually can have a huge effect on how someone perceives the world or perceives themselves. So I think he's absolutely correct. And any process, if you will, that allows us to get at this core of goodness within ourselves, I'm certainly a supporter of. I have a lot of people involved with my work who are Buddhists. And as I may have mentioned, I'm an atheist. And they have a tendency to promote Buddhist practices, which is wonderful, and there's reason for that. But I also tell them that if there are practices from Scientology or the Book of Mormon that can benefit an individual and that you can remove the dogma associated with them, I'm certainly for all of those as well. Because again, there are certain truths that are present in a whole variety of areas, including religion, that if you really look at them, and the reason they've been around for thousands of years is because they work. Now, over those thousands of years, people may attach dogma to them, such as meditation or different practices. But the fact of the matter is, experientially, we know they work. And that's what I'm interested in, is finding those practices that, if you will, make us the best version of our authentic self.
Nice. You know, one of the persons, Kailash, is saying that his niece has got COVID. She's only 14 years old. And he's just wondering, are there any neurological, physical side effects of COVID in teens? And the doctors here are unable to give a definite direction. And he was wondering whether you have any understanding of, from neurological side effects, does COVID have any effect like that on young people?
Yeah, I certainly am not an expert at that. We do know that, at least in older adults, it can have effects on an individual's cognition. In fact, I think up to 20%. Probably a younger person has more resources to overcome that. As we know, a young child who even has a brain injury, actually the neural pathways will redirect, and they oftentimes won't suffer any neurologic deficit. But I really can't say for sure. We do know there are certain conditions that do affect children who have COVID more than others. But again, talking about how one person is affected versus how thousands of people are affected are two completely different things. You know, there may be a minimal incidence of something happening, but if it happens to you, it doesn't really matter what the incidence is. And the other side of the coin, of course, is if it's so unlikely that it's going to happen, then you should not focus on that.
You know, Shankar Raghavan is asking a question. What is the correlation between love and compassion?
Well, I think they're very related. Love is, if you will, the ability to look at another and see yourself and treat them as you wish to be treated. And what I mean by that is it's this embracing care and concern for another human being or even an animal. But the challenge for many people is this idea of love or compassion oftentimes only extends to your family, your loved ones, your friends. And as you get further and further away, it becomes more and more challenging. And one of the problems that we face as humans is this issue of tribalism. People feel comfortable and safe when they are around people who look like them, act like them, are of the same religion, the same culture, the same socioeconomic class. And while that is wonderful, this issue of tribalism, though, oftentimes separates them from others. And while it may be supportive of you, when you start looking through the lens of I'm better than you and you're the other, then it has very negative consequences. And what we need in the world today, as we see what's happening, we need people to look through the lens and see everyone as themselves. If you see everyone as yourself, then you automatically know how to act.
That's right. Thanks a lot, James. It's been absolutely, inspirational to be in your presence. There are three aspects of the conversation today that I want to really make my own and carry them in my heart. As a 12-year-old, an angel appeared in your life, Ruth. She had that full presence. She looked into your eyes and there was a connection. And she made you realize that this inner chatter of the mind that was telling you that you are not good enough, that why has this happened to you and why am I a victim? She replaced that with a conversation about you are complete. You have everything inside you to manifest. And she gave you the gift of 6 weeks of conversations. And she was a much older woman. And yet she spoke to you as an equal. That was a wonderful conversation. It completely transformed. And you said, anything is possible. And then, much later in your life, when His Holiness appeared in your life, he experienced your authenticity. He understood that you had gone through this whole cycle of earning lots of money, name, fame, power, and then you had decided that that was not worth it. That the biggest thing about yourself you realized is that you loved yourself when you were the giving, generous, kind person. And when he found that in you, intuitively he connected to that purpose and he made that donation. And what a wonderful thing. That connection between you and His Holiness, just like with Ruth, that connection to do the larger good together. What a gift to have. And the third part, I have spent time in Japan and I serve on the board of a Japanese university. And what you reminded me and reminded Sapan and all of us all, there are things inside us. There is the shadow side. There are the issues. There are the dark side. There are the so-called broken things. But let's honor the fact that we went astray. We did things that were not worthwhile when we look back. Just like that broken pottery with gold. Look at it. I am completely like that. And yet there is a witness in me that observes that defect. And let me honor the witness. Let that manifest. So what a wonderful gift. And of course, the Korean band making your, what a delightful story. I'm going to listen to that song if I can get hold of it. I'm sure it's there somewhere on YouTube.
Well, I have to be honest with you. It's in Korean and I have no understanding of it, but it's still a very popular song. And it's amazing because, this is a group that has inspired millions of people worldwide. Yes. And again, many of their songs, if not all of them, are in Korean. And so I don't even understand it. But the interesting thing is this group is all about self-care. It's about love. It's about connection. And these are these truths that have been demonstrated all through our humanity, all through religions. And I think one of the reasons that people connect with them is because these individuals actually care. They care about themselves, they care about others, and they're on a mission to heal, if you will, many, many people who have suffered. And so I think it's quite wonderful.
Thank you. And Sapan, would you like to say something at the end of our conversation?
So I guess you've really summarized it very well, the entire discussion. I would just add one thing which I really found very powerful when Dr. Doty said that he found his purpose, or that maybe we can find our purpose through helping others. This is something that we don't often realize. And I guess going back to the agenda of today's discussion, becoming the best version of ourselves, I guess it is very important that compassion and helping others, how powerful it is and how powerful it is to transform ourselves. And I guess it gives us the same benefit as you mentioned, as say a 5-kilometer run or an hour spent in gym. So we all should practice compassion, and it will definitely help us in becoming a better version of ourselves, if not the best.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
You
you.
know, it's interesting because oftentimes people will say, well, I don't have money, I don't have power. What can I really do? But literally, for every one of us, within our capacity is to improve one person's life every day. And
Thank
if
you.
you can do that, oftentimes that's just enough.
Thank you very much. Thank you. What a remarkable gift to have. Thank you very much. And thank you all the listeners and for viewing this wonderful experience.